Thank you very much. I want to say particular note to Professor Wang, Professor Liu, and I will be followed by Professor Zhu. It's really impressive to see the scale of work that our colleagues in China are doing. I've been planning to show a bit of the work that we'd been doing in China, and felt that once I saw the program that it was going to be duly covered. But it's a statement about, I think, how mature the profession has become in China. And when we start talking about green infrastructure and you look at the scale of the work there, these are incredible benchmarks for the scale of work that we should be aspiring to, both here in the UK and throughout Europe. So thank you very much for your presentations. They've been a pleasure to watch. I'm Eric Hallquist. I'm the Director of Landscape Architecture for AECOM in the UK and the Middle East. Today I'm going to talk about the role we as landscape architects are playing in the process of city making. And when we talk about city making, it's the creation of space, the creation of places for people. But our places for people are beautiful places, but here today I want to talk about how they're underwritten by their performance. Green infrastructure for us is that's not a scheme. A green infrastructure underwrites our schemes. People generally aren't interested in drainage. People aren't interested in SUD systems and renewable energy. People are interested in people. People are attracted to people. So we have to create places that draw people together and then underwrite them with their performance. And when we underwrite them with their performance, sometimes it's direct, sometimes it's very subversive. And sometimes we're bringing that to clients. Sometimes it's just something we're doing for ourselves. But it's those principles that have to underwrite the beautiful places we create for people. The world is changing rapidly. By 2050, 70% of the world will be living in cities. And cities are machines. They take a huge amount of infrastructure to operate. That infrastructure requires energy. When you look at this, 75 million people rely on industry for their drinking water. And this isn't just in far-off dry lands. That's ours in Becton. So we have to understand that our urbanization, we are using more than we have. And when we use more than we have to rely on industry. When we talk about green infrastructure, we need to be talking about green infrastructure on the scale of this industry. And we need to be talking about it in a way where we understand that scale as landscape architects. We have to be central to these conversations. So I want to talk today about some examples where as landscape architects, where we have been central in these teams and the ascension of landscape architects into these teams, where green infrastructure has been deeply embedded in the performance of landscapes and the creation of landscapes, but also the understanding of what are the products that these landscapes are producing. And it's once you understand the products that you are required to produce, you know how to manipulate them. And so I want to talk about three distinct products today. I want to talk about water, healthy cities, and human health, and then air. Healthy cities are places that we just need to be out of doors. This happens in the UK, this happens in America, China, and the Middle East, being out of doors, the act of exercising, the act of moving. And understanding what makes our landscapes is so important, and how to make them. I think there was a great fact today that 1 cubic centimeter of soil takes 100 years to manufacture. We're in the process of figuring out how to manufacture hundreds of hectares of soil in places that didn't have soil medium before. What is the opportunity there? How do you make it? What's the recipe, and what does it do? It's the third largest carbon store next to geology and the oceans. So first I want to talk about water. I wouldn't get in the door at an LI event if I wasn't talking about water and sustainable drainage. But our first project I want to talk about is Northwest Cambridge. That site that I just showed, that's a greenfield site. It's the edge of Cambridge. It's a former classroom. Agriculture was once part of the curriculum at Cambridge University, and it's no longer an active part of that, of the curriculum there. And Cambridge is, as esteemed as Cambridge University is worldwide, Cambridge University faces a highly competitive market to attract students, to attract faculty, researchers. And the nature of universities is evolving, and it's a global market. When you charge £9,000 per student per year, those students have a world of choice of where they want to attend universities. Our campuses need to be ready to address that competition. Cambridge had a really difficult decision. They knew they needed to evolve. Cambridge is short on housing, affordable housing. They were losing their postdocs and their postgrads and needed to build a place. But the place in which they owned, the piece of land they owned, was greenbelt. Had a large amount of habitat, badgers, newts, triple SI site, protected landscapes. And so for them to venture into that area and start to create a new extension of the university, they had to address these issues very seriously. And in doing so, they had to think about their longer-term return on their investment. And a university, and especially somebody like Cambridge, is a fantastic client when they're talking about this patient investment, a longer-term return, and the quality that embeds the work that they are doing, because it's reflected in the quality of the campus and the place in which they've been. So Cambridge, we were working with them for the better part of 15 years, helping them understand what their needs were, what the market pressures were, what the global competitive pressures were, and working with the planners to help them unlock that piece of land. 3,000 homes, 50% of those are key worker housing, 100,000 square meters of academic space, and social infrastructure to support. But part of that also required delivering to a Code for Sustainable Homes Level 5, BREEAM Excellent, no loss of existing habitat, and underwriting those exemplary standards had to be a highly functional landscape to support that. But this landscape, this campus, this place had to be as much about the city of Cambridge, about Cambridge University, and as much about Cambridgeshire. So an understanding of how Cambridge University evolved as so integrated into the urban fabric is the benchmark in which how this new development needed to evolve as well. And being on the fringe of Cambridge, it needed to make really strong links, but those links were back into the city, but also out into the countryside. So underwriting the master plan was performance, connectivity, pedestrian and cycle connectivity, lowering car ownership, a green infrastructure, but one of conveyance, of water harvesting and recycling, protection of protected lands, the triple SI, and historic ridge and furrow, agriculture land, permanent pasture, but also then the creation of a new public open space, the western edge. So all of that performance is about water, but it's also about minimizing the amount of material that's taken off site, and asking, in particular, this western edge to perform very, very heavily. This is a machine in its own right, but it still has to be a place for the residents who live there. 3 steps to the stormwater strategy, from source control down to street and green corridors. Some of those are adopted, some are not. Highly, highly complicated relationships with adopting and maintaining those corridors, and then leading on to this western edge. So the idea of streets and movement through the campus starts with goes back to that sense of that kind of the verdant streets of Cambridge, but redefining those. And the idea that these spaces of conveyance offer so many other functions. Every space in here is performing on 3-4 different levels, on conveyance, on storage, ecology and biodiversity. And the idea that these places for people and infrastructure can be shared. What one day on a sunny day is a dry lawn to sit on, 2 days later might be an attenuation basin. Now that conveyance leads to the western edge. You couldn't ask for a more difficult site. You're up against the M11. It has a huge amount of, it has a huge responsibility to do nothing more. If this thing did nothing more than just attenuate or dampen the noise from the M11, it would be a success. But then it had an existing watercourse through it, the Wash Pit Brook. That has to not be overrun by the additional runoff that was coming from the site. But it also has to then function in independent systems about catching, cleaning, and recycling the water that comes to that space. And it has a tremendous amount of biologic and habitat responsibility. Again, there were badgers, voles, newts, and none of that habitat could be lost. In fact, it needed to be increased. So we took and we shaped this space. We had 250,000 cubic meters of site arisings coming from the construction of the homes. And in that, manipulating that, using that topography in a very complex way to separate the water courses, to dampen that noise from the M11, but also then to become areas that people could enjoy, memorable places that you can have human experiences. This was the active open space for this development. And these spaces are floodable. They change throughout the year. And that sense, while people aren't attracted to drainage, that the fact that green infrastructure can become part of their lives and they understand the rhythm of our annual cycles, that can be appreciated, but it wasn't the driving factor here. But we had to figure out how, with that expansion of and that functional role, that the landscape still provided that recreational use. So, but it's still a beautiful place. It's, here we are reducing noise pollution by 15 decibels, but also that long berm is a connection back to the countryside. It's that link between Cambridge and the countryside. 250,000 cubic meters of construction spoil, but that gives you these incredible vistas and viewpoints. It's expansive and an engaging landscape. It's part of a site-wide recycling network, but we looked at what were those elements of infrastructure that were required to be visible, and how could they be translated. We worked with artists and Robin Lee architects to look at all of the infrastructure pieces around all of the development and treat them as if they were follies, these little beautiful pieces, these kind of little jewels that move around. A substation is now something you enjoy walking past. But then at the end of the day, it needed to not burden that existing landscape, but enhance it. So we were reducing that downstream peak flow by 25% at the same time of being a beautiful and pleasurable place to be. And I think fundamentally, the fact that I like the most is, and this is something that comes from Code for Sustainable Homes Level 5, is we had to reduce that potable water consumption. So all of that water that's coming down, going through those ponds, is then pumped back into the network and used as part of the gray water systems in all those buildings. This is happening. This isn't abstract. This is happening right now. These are some pictures from April. We're looking at phase 1 here to be completed by the 19th of September. We've been working with a tremendous team of architects and engineers. We were fortunate to work with what was Scott Wilson and URS, who are now part of our AECOM family, who have done all of the civil engineering, drainage engineering, an amazing cast of architects: Alison Brooks, Wilkinson, Eyre, McGrenner, Lavington, amongst others, and artists, and it's been a joy to work on. But these kind of projects need great clients, and I think this was one that was a great client where we've had a lasting relationship with, and are now looking at the next site for West Cambridge, just south of this, and taking their research and biomedical campus up to the next level. Now, from Cambridge, I'm going to jump to the Middle East. And as I said, I wanted to touch on some of our work in Asia, but I'm going to focus here on the Middle East. And the reason why is because we have the opportunity in the Middle East where, like I think Asia is, there's an investment. And this investment, it's a different type of investment, but it's an investment of scale that I think we can all take lessons back and apply to the work that we all do on a daily basis. I'm going to talk about healthy cities, and I'm going to talk about healthy cities and the idea of the importance of just being out of doors and the encouragement to get out of doors. The investment in places like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Doha, we're in the kind of third wave of that, and we're seeing the consequence of some of the first boom in these cities, but then also what is the cause and effect that to the people living there. These cities, as they've expanded, have been kind of built on the principle that people don't want to be outdoors, that it's too difficult to be outdoors, that nobody's ever going to go outdoors because you're going to drive from point A to point B. The malls and private developments are the public realm in Middle Eastern cities. But the clients are starting to now, and the governments are starting to recognize that, and they recognize these problems and want to make a change. About 10 years ago, we started working with Qatar Foundation for Education City in Doha. This was an Arata Isesaki master plan. Buildings by some of the best architects in the world, OMA, Richard Legarreta, amongst others. But it was a very large parcel master plan, and we were brought in to do the landscape. Within that, we built a park, and a park where exercise could be central to education. And here the universities were facing very similar pressures in that global market to what Cambridge is facing, where they were competing for their students, but to get their students back. They're seeing a huge amount of flight of some of the smartest and best educated citizens of the Middle East. And so this investment in this campus and exercise and being out of doors being central to it, and a central park with very active elements of sports fields, running tracks, and passive elements of gardens. And so this is something, again, similar to Cambridge. We're just coming into the next term with this fully operational. And the interweaving of these different uses of the running tracks, the sports pitches. Here we have an equestrian track, shaded areas, trying to extend these seasons and extend the time of day in which people want to be out of doors. And this drives right into the very heart of the campus. The athletics drive right up to the student center, and the passive gardens relate to some of the residential areas. But it's the importance of exercise and education, increasing memory and attention span, relieving stress, and especially in the Middle East, being out of doors. Further, and then in Qatar, we've been looking at the public realm for the country of Qatar. And how do you do public realm for an entire country? We were employed by Ashgal, their highways department, who recognized that the quality of the public realm was very poor, especially in comparison with those private developments, and they were suffering economically from getting tenants into buildings that fell within the public sector domain. And so working with across the country to do character assessments and identify the subtle differences, things that maybe we weren't always picking up on, which we could help expand upon and bring new and identity to these rapidly growing communities. And I'll just highlight one point in particular that was one of my favorites to attack, was that this oversized vehicular infrastructure of starting to get into that, and there was something called the free right turn, where there was no stop or anything, and somehow you have to cross it without getting clipped by a car coming around the corner at 30 miles an hour. And just pulling that out and controlling junctions. And that ability in a utility-free zone where that road was coming across, to plant that. And from planting that, you start to create spaces, inhabitable spaces that you're tempering that heat, you're lowering the urban heat island effect, and also then your opportunity to activate these streets where in many places there's no ground floor street activity. We took that then further. This is a roundabout today. What is a new roundabout when we start to attack that infrastructure in an intelligent way? Or an alley now is a way to link a school and a mosque in a rural community. Or even further out into the hinterlands where a motorway was completely severing communities and the abilities for local camel farmers to just get from one side to the other. And even bringing ideas that we are all perfecting here on a daily basis, our home zone streets, and bringing those into communities. This is nothing but car parking normally, and coming in with, again, play areas, areas for children and families. And finally, I want to touch on air quality and CO2 in particular. Here and this is a picture of Abu Dhabi. This was a place that 50 years ago wasn't necessarily producing carbon dioxide and air pollutants at the way in which it is today. Here, globally, we are well beyond our global carbon tipping point. And we need to start making significant endeavors to actually start to reduce that. Paris Accord is very important to that. But in those growing, in these developing countries, there's a huge amount of additional CO2 that's pumping in, and that's having a great effect on our global air quality. But we can't just point the finger at developing countries. You know, we are using these resources just as fast, and as I refer back to my Becton image. Desalination underpins lots of these countries, especially in arid climates, and these stats are regularly available about what is the carbon production and the impact of an Olympics swimming pool worth of desalinated water. But are we thinking about that in terms of how we handle our landscapes? Just the image here alone, just the landscape within this photograph, right? I think there's 12 palm trees or so in here. This landscape creates 3,700 kilos of CO2 per year. That's a 10-minute flight on a 747, or you could drive your car for 6 days, just by what's being produced here. The carbon production here is not outweighed by the sequestration in that landscape. So we were then offered Abu Dhabi Airport, 120 hectares of inaccessible landscape, purely to be traveled through and seen from afar. I expect the room to boo at this point. Okay, I'm almost finished. And this is just and here we had to underwrite this with something. It's a visual landscape, a landscape to pass through. Topography, it's a Repton-esque landscape of setting a grand building, of choreographing space, of translating the first impression or lasting memory of a place into something, but it had to be underpinned by what it could do. We needed it to underpin it with what we could do. So we work with Irritech, great irrigation designers, and who help us with understanding how we change the way in which we plant, the way in which we use things like aggregates as vegetation, contrast and material. Boulders and trees can be interchangeable for how they perform. And then fundamentally, again, similar to Cambridge, this is 1 million cubic meters of construction spoil from a new runway and from a terminal. This uses 2 liters per square meter of water per day on an average, and it saves 1 million liters of water per day. When you start to understand what that is, and going back to that soil makeup, we're making soils here. When we start to know that recipe, we can start to embed that carbon back into the landscape. and that a landscape like this can actually sequester carbon on a scale that is a piece of green infrastructure in its own right. Thank you very much.